Hello everyone.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay? Is this a good volume? I get louder when I get more strength, and I get stronger as I go. Thank you so much for being here, and for participating with your presence and your bodies in literature, in showing up to this bookstore, and for this book, and for all the lovely people who made it possible. I'm in a room full of folks who really believe in books and the power of language first and foremost. And as a poet, I was a poet first and foremost, and we're taught never to expect anybody waiting at the end of the sentence. And in fact, that's a good advice. That's a good way to write. And so to have a room like this, in a store like this, filled up is bonus. It's all gravy, vegan gravy. And, so thank you for being extra, because that's what it feels like to me. We'll talk a little, I'll read a short section, and then we'll have a conversation. Thank you to Emma and Michael and the Books Are Magic staff for having this space and for having us. To my partner Peter, my agent Francis Cody, my publicist Juliana Kian. All of this wouldn't be possible without y'all and my lovely friends here. I'll talk a little bit about this section. I'm going to read a short section, about 5 minutes. A lot of this book is a meditation on these women, these immigrant women who are pivotal in thinking and making American identity for the character Little Dog, the protagonist. I knew I wanted to write about these women in relation to diaspora and war and survival, because being a son of women of war, I've always felt that survival was an incredibly creative act. It is not an act of stasis or passivity. It's one that requires incredible amounts of innovation. And it is often the women who pick up the pieces after war, both psychological and physical, healing the soldiers, fixing the homes, and making a future. But the cost of that is incredible. And I wanted to portray that honestly and thoroughly, that as powerful and agent-filled as those acts are, the cost on their mental health and their physical health is extraordinary. And so this is a little scene that sort of portrays some of these challenges. I'm dragged into a hole darker than the night around it by two women. Only when one of them screams do I know who I am. I see their heads, black hair matted from the floor they sleep on. The air sharp with a chemical delirium as they jostle in the blur of the car's interior. Eyes still thick with sleep, I make out the shapes, a headrest, a felt monkey the size of a thumb swinging from the rear view, a piece of metal, shining, then gone. The car peels out of the driveway, and I can tell from the smell of acetone and nail polish that it's your tan and rust Toyota. You and Grandma Lon are in the front, clamoring for something that won't show itself. The streetlights fling by, hitting your faces with the force of blows. He's gonna kill her, Ma. He's gonna do it this time, you say, breathless. We riding helicopter fast, Lon says. She is in her own mind, red and dense with obsession. We riding where? She clutches the flip-down mirror with both hands. I can tell by her voice that she is smiling, or at least gritting her teeth. He's gonna kill my sister, Mama. You sound like you're flailing down a river. I know, Carl, it's for real this time. You hear me, Ma? Lan rocks side to side from the mirror, making whooshing sounds. We getting out of here, huh? We gotta go far, little dog. Outside, the night surges by like sideways gravity. The green numbers on the dash read 3:04 a.m. Who put my hands in my face? The tires squeal at each turn. The streets are empty and it feels like a universe in here. In everything, hurling through the cosmic dark, while in the front seat, the women who raised me are losing their minds. Through my fingers, the night is black construction paper. Only the frazzled heads of these two before me are clear, swaying. Don't worry, Mai. You're speaking to yourself now. Your face so close to the windshield, the glass fogs a ring that spreads in equal measure to your words. I'm coming. We're coming. After a while, we swerve down a street lined with Continentals. The car crawls, then stops in front of a gray clapboard townhouse. Mai, you say, pulling the emergency brake. He's gonna kill Mai. Lan, who all this time had been shaking her head from side to side, stops, as if the words have finally touched a little button inside her. What? Who killed who? Who died this time? Both of you stay in the car, you say. You unbuckle your belt, leap out, and shuffle toward the house, the door left open behind you. There's a story, Lan would tell, of Lady Chee, the mythical woman warrior who led an army of men and repelled the Chinese invasion of ancient Vietnam. I think of her seeing you. How, as legend goes, armed with 2 swords, she'd fling her yard-long breasts over her shoulders and cut down the invaders by the dozens. How it was always a woman who saved us. Who die now? Lan swings around. Her face, made stark by the overhead light, ripples with this new knowledge. Who gonna die, little dog? She flips her hand back and forth, as if opening a locked door to indicate emptiness. Somebody kill you? For what? But I'm not listening. I'm rolling down the window, arms burning with each turn. Cool November air. My stomach grabs as I watch you mount the front steps, the 9-inch machete glinting in your hand. You knock on the door, shouting, "Come out, Carl," you say in Vietnamese. "Come out, you fucker. I'm taking her home for good. You can have the car, just give me my sister." At the word sister, your voice cracks into a short, busted sob before regaining control. You bash the door with the machete's wooden butt. The porch lights turn on. Your pink nightgown suddenly green under the fluorescent. The door opens. You step back. A man appears. He half lunges from the doorway as you backpedal down the steps, the blade locked at your side as if pinned in place. "He has a gun," Lan whisper shouts from the car, now lucid. "Rose, it's a shotgun. It shoots 2 eaters at once. They eat your lungs inside out. Little dog, tell her." Your hands float over your head. The metal clanks on the driveway. The man, huge, his shoulders sloped under a gray Yankee sweatshirt, steps up to you, says a few words through his teeth, then kicks the machete to the side. It disappears in the grass with a flash. You mumble something, make yourself small, cup your hands under your chin, the posture you take after receiving a tip at the nail salon. The man lowers his gun as you back away, shaking toward the car. "It's not worth it, Rose," Lan says, cupping her mouth with both hands. "You can't beat a gun. You just can't. come back. Come back in the helicopter. Ma, I hear myself say, my voice cracking. Ma, come on. You edge slowly into the driver's seat, turn to me with a nauseated stare. There's a long silence. I think you're about to laugh, but then your eyes fill. So I turn away, to the man carefully eyeing us, hand on his hip, the gun clamped between his armpit, pointed at the ground, protecting his family. When you start to talk, your voice is scraped out. I catch only parts of it. It's not Mai's house, you explain, fumbling with your keys. Or rather, Mai is no longer there. The boyfriend, Carl, who used to slam her head against the wall, is no longer there. This is somebody else, a white man with a shotgun and a bald head. It was a mistake, you're saying to Lan, an accident. But Mai has not lived here for 5 years, Lan says with sudden tenderness. Rose. Although I don't see it, I can tell she's brushing your hair behind your ear. Mai moved to Florida, remember? To open her own salon. Lan is poised, her shoulders relaxed. Someone else has stepped inside her and started moving her limbs, her lips. We go home. You need sleep, Rose. We go home now. The engine starts. The car lurches into a U-turn. As we pull away from the porch, a boy no older than I am points a toy pistol at us. The gun jumps and his mouth makes blasting noises. His father turns to yell at him. He shoots once, 2 more times. From the window of my helicopter, I look at him. I look him dead in the eyes and do what you do. I refuse to die.
Hello. What an extraordinary scene to kick this off with. I was thinking about both sort of as you introduced it and then as you were reading it, the kind of the layers of history that are present there in that scene and also in that voice. And I wondered if that, in a sense, was always the real subject, in a sense, of this novel.
I think so, absolutely. I'm often, while I was writing this, but I think always inspired by Roland Barthes' work, particularly Camera Lucida. And there's one moment in Camera Lucida where he talks about punctum and studium. Punctum is this moment where the photo pierces the viewer, where in a very idiosyncratic way, so that each participant in a photograph has her own punctum. And at one moment, and often he talks about like where the hands are placed in a wedding photograph, how healthy someone's teeth is or what have you. But there was one moment where there's a photograph of a prisoner, a southern prisoner during shortly after the Civil War, part of this spree that led to Lincoln's execution. And one of them was caught in prison. It's a photograph of just a man behind a wall, sitting next to a wall in the back of him. And he says there's no punctum in the photo, but in the photo, the punctum for him is time, and which is death. So this figure is pierced by the context of death and history. And I thought about that. It was an incredible moment where so much can be articulated off the page. And we know this, as readers and writers, but to have it articulated in such a way, I always knew that I didn't necessarily have to tend to history for it to be present. And another writer and thinker who's always influential to me, and I know to you, David Ward-Yarnowitz, has his famous quote is, "History haunts me." And I think the thing about being haunted is that you don't have a choice. You don't have much to say in it. You merely participate. So I knew that I could write about anything. I could really write about Mars, and it would still be inflected by the history that I see around me, specifically as a refugee in the American space.
There's also the way in which, so when you are creating a prose narrative for a reader, you're providing them with a series of contexts, which sounds like the most boring possible description of what goes on, but you are, and part of the way in which tension is sustained is by how, like, which one you are leaning into at any given moment. And it's the way in which that information is provided, but this is a terribly wonky question suddenly. And I guess what I was aware of was the way in which, almost as if like different lenses were dropping down at different moments. These are like the reference to the mythical warrior, for example, in that one passage. And that amazing description of like her breasts yard long thrown over each shoulder while she's going into battle. And then the sort of incredible, almost tenderness with which the machete is knocked away after that. And it's and so there's all these, and there's the sense of the madness of the mother, the madness of the grandmother, the narrator who is like feeling trapped by all of it, pinned by all of it in a sense, and whose only escape is into the story that they're telling us, but really telling the mother. And I don't even know if that's all of it, but I don't even know if that's a question. I suppose.
No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, that scene can be easily an allegory of what it means to live with folks with mental illness. Is that sometimes you do take the back seat, literally, because who's to say that they are wrong with what they've been through? And so, in a way, as a child observing it, you learn that certain faults and failures leads to discoveries. And I think what I was interested in was not creating a binary for any circumstance, and to always look for the myriad multiplicity in the situations. And I think one of the most inspiring writers that I've encountered in writing this book was Herman Melville in Moby Dick. And I think what happened in Moby Dick was that here's a writer who, retroactively, we understand, would stand at the crux of American letters and decided not to compromise anything. 30 pages on how to harvest spermaceti? Sure.
And he was providing a context for the ending.
Yes. and a theological meditation and racial meditation on whiteness as it relates to the whale, as it relates to himself, as it relates to the futurity of this country. Essayistic, ventures into the power of storytelling, right? And then tending to this huge epic of whale hunting. He just said yes to everything. And I think it was so pivotal for that to be the marker of the epicenter for American novel, because, looking back at that, I thought to myself, what would happen if an Asian American writer decided no longer to compromise? What would happen in the gaze when tending to these subjects of survivors, these women who survived? What would happen as a writer if I no longer compromised where my curiosity led me? And so the mythologies, the theological asides, Roland Barthes' theory, grappling with that, contradicting that, contending with that, all of that seemed possible because of what was happening with Moby Dick. And I knew I didn't want to write 600 pages. And so the epistolary form was perfect for it, because then the plot was the dialogue. That was important to me. There's not much quote-unquote linear plot here, but I would insist that the main plot is one American body speaking to another. And as we know, Americans in Conversation has all the tenets of good fiction. It has all the fraught drama, terror, excitement, and hope in any conversation and dialogue. And I would say that the main plot is communication, which is what I felt as a poet first and foremost. The poem is a way of thinking via language between two people.
I mean, it's almost an open letter, in a sense. But I'm thinking of lyric address, of the second person, of the way in which a narrative is made possible by your sense of who is listening, and who it is addressed to. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in the decisions that you made.
Yeah. The letter solved that form, that desire to have the parenthetical, the essayistic detours. So if I to branch away on a parenthetical meditation, I could go back, and that back would not be a temporal space in a plot line, but it would be the letter, which is the present. But on top of that, there was this desire to speak to another Vietnamese American body, so that for the novel to be exhausted by a reader, they literally had to eavesdrop between a conversation between two Asian people. And that felt like a powerful concept for me, because often I'm often catching up to the context of whiteness that never considered me, and if I don't know it, I'm out. Right? I'm out of comprehension. But I'm not interested in that sort of retaliation, but it was more focused about holding the concerns of these folks that were present to me, and holding their concerns as a priority. In order to move through the book in any way, you had to look through every single word that was meant for somebody else. And that was how I think I had the chutzpah, as we say, to move through it. Because I never thought I would be a novelist. I always thought that would be fine for the next life. But my teacher Ben Lerner is here, and he was always telling me, you could do anything. You could just do it. And he walked the walk as well, which is really nice to have. Because sometimes you have teachers who say a bunch of stuff, and then they just, who knows.
Who knows if they live by it.
Right. But he did it, and I said, you know what, maybe. And I struggled with my way into it, but I thought, if I could tell a story, and have it become this bridge between one yellow body and another, I think I will have enough courage to do it. Because it won't be about being a novelist, it will be about trying to get it right, trying to be an apprentice of the sentence, and earnestly ask, at times plead, the tool of language to say, let me get close to this thing I want to say. Especially when you're talking to parents, because sometimes the way they save us is to turn their back on their own lives. And so when you're writing in this way, you're almost a traitor. You betray them. You betray everything they've survived in order to preserve them. And it's a paradox I don't think I'll ever come to terms with as a writer. And I don't think we have to. I don't think, often we're asked, how do you come to terms? How do you make peace with it? And I think it's very important for those who struggle in larger geopolitical structures to say, how can I come to terms? Have you come to terms? It's interesting that we often ask those who are harmed by larger geopolitical violences whether they've come to terms with things that seem impossible to do. And so I think the biggest moment for me writing this book was to say, I'll never come to terms, but I can get close to understanding. And that's something.
So I was thinking about this description you gave recently of the structure that you, the Japanese structure that you looked at for this novel, and I wondered if you would talk a little bit about that, because it sounded like a fascinating way to find like other models for what you wanted to present,
Right.
Other answers, other possibilities. How did you come to it?
Kisho Tenketsu is a Japanese form. It's actually a Chinese form that was used on the level of the line. And the Japanese turned it into a 4 panel narrative structure for narrative art and fiction. But I teach Basho and The Narrow Road to the Deep North, and he uses that. I mean, that was kind of the radical hybridity in his work, where narrative progression happens through proximity. That tension and drama could happen through proximity and not linear conflicts. So it's a form that refuses to employ conflict as a means to satisfy a plot. And that felt like a very generative way of thinking for me, because when I started to earnestly learn as a novelist, I read the craft books and all that, as you do. And what I encountered was that conflict and destruction were always necessary, at least in the Western narrative framework, right? David and Goliath, etc. So a lot of our Western canon comes from the Greco-Roman mythologies. And in that space, conquest was a way of building a protagonist's self-worth, right? Sons have to destroy their fathers or their elders in order to supplant them in the present. And I knew that I wanted to write about American violence, but I wanted to do it in a way that refuses to enact and repeat American violence. And so I had to look to a different form. And when I saw Miyazaki's films and Studio Ghibli employing Kisho Tenketsu. Kisho is ki, which is introduction, to introduce characters. Sho is the deepening of the characters. Eng is a turn. It's not a plot twist, it's just a turn. It's just a new element. And then ketsu is accumulation. Not conclusion, not summary. It's simply the accumulation of all agents that played a part in this world arriving at one place. So it's a gathering. It builds its force not through momentum, but through tension. Just like in poetry, words live this way. I've always felt that poetry was the closest thing to chemistry. You have hydrogen, and that's fine on its own. You have oxygen, fine and complete on its own. You put them in the same proximity, side by side, and now you have water. words live the same way. As a poet, I learned that you can throw words around and they have different power on the page depending on who stands beside them. And I thought if I can turn what I learned as a poet into a larger narrative structure, following the same trajectory as the Chinese linear form in the poem, when it radicalized into the Japanese, into a narrative structure, I can almost retrace the steps of the evolution of that form into my own evolution as a writer. And so it was incredibly powerful for me to be able to say, no one in this book had to be destroyed to realize the protagonist's self-worth. That felt important to me.
I'm wondering if you... So was this something then that came out of your teaching these poems? A realization that accumulated gradually in the process of the teaching?
Yeah, because you don't want to be you don't want to be lost in front of your students, So teaching has taught me to read better because I didn't want to let them down, because they look to you with hope that you can, I don't think of it as a hierarchical structure. I don't see myself as an authority figure, but I realize the power dynamics in teaching. And so you're always kind of opening the way and you have to gain their trust. And so I had to do my homework, and I learned that teaching helped me read better and read more thoroughly, and also to read criticism and scholarship, to have different takes on everything. And so, yeah, reading, I teach a hybrid course. I teach Dictate by Teresa Hawking Cha, all the way down to Maggie Nelson and Claudia Rankine, Marguerite Duras, The Lover, which is important for this book, and also Annie Dillard's For the Time Being, which is incredible. I mean, that book is a master class on the power of proximity. She uses no bridging languages, right? Every moment is a fragment on its own. But when you get about 2/3 through the book, you realize that it's absolutely liquid in its fluidity and what it does to the psyche. Because when we read something, we read a paragraph, we carry the impressions of it. Right? Every paragraph is like a ghost. It stays and it haunts us as we move. So when you're reading through something, you're moving through phantoms. And every single chapter or paragraph has an impression on you.
So we met up a few years ago and had a conversation under the auspices of having an interview for a Swedish magazine, which I kind of love. That was what happened. We're big in Sweden. And at the time I remember you said something so fascinating that I've been thinking about the whole time. I mean, a number of things were fascinating, but I remember in particular you said to me that you were going to write a memoir, which is not what happened. And also that you had been fascinated by the Icelandic tradition by which writers were trained, where the writer had to be a poet first before anything else. And so I wonder what that all looks like now with this in front of you.
Yes, I went to Iceland years ago, and I learned that the tradition there is that you introduce yourself to the literary world as a poet first. They have a great reverence for the sagas, and it's almost disrespectful in a way to be a debut novelist. Get the line right. And I think my apprenticeship as a poet was the best thing for a writer. And if I had it my way, I would really advise every writer to really have an earnest participation in poetry, even if you don't want to publish it. Understand how the line works. Because the sentence is one thing, but when you have the line, what you're confronted with is fracture at every turn, both in the caesura and with the right margin. Right? What happens then is that you're asked to innovate. Every few words, you're asked to innovate. You're asked to how to break yourself newly in order to find new meaning. And you'll realize right away, drafting a few poems, that there's so many possibilities in the middle of the sentence, between every word. So with that, you have a more embodied understanding of language. And that can only help you when you break the building blocks down to the molecular level of the word. And even in between the words, I've broken words in half. You'll realize that that's the essential moment of being a writer, is to break this all down. And I think collapse and rupture was incredibly important for me in this way. Partway through this book, about halfway through, it crumbles into poems. And that was very important for me because when we think about the American novel, we often say the great American novel. And it's often written by men, right? Or participated by men. And often the attempt is to write the statement of an era, right? The tone of how life is for XYZ, for whatever generation. And so there's a sort of monolithic presence to that. And I think I was more interested in enacting collapse within that tradition. What if I were to write an American novel that fell apart? Because maybe that's more faithful to me in what it means to live in an American body. That sometimes we actually fall apart. And then the question then is, what happens? You should be failing if you're a novelist who your book falls apart after 140 pages. But I realized that when language falls apart, it starts to look like poetry. And that was always there. That backbone was always there. And so it collapsed into poetry, and then it picks itself up again. So that failure was just a stage, a temporal stage in the line of discovery, which is what I always hope. We always hope language would lead to discovery. And why fiction and not a memoir? I tried it. I couldn't do it because I was so interested in making stuff up. And because that's what I did with my poems. And I think I live in a different plane for memoirists. I think I respect nonfiction too much. I respect journalism too much. That this book would never hold up to fact checking. And it was more important to me too because, one of our literary ancestors in the Asian American community is Maxine Hong Kingston. And when she wrote her book, she said, I want to write the great American novel, Woman Warrior. And her publishers, for whatever reason, convinced her to call it a memoir, right? Memoirs of a childhood amongst ghosts.
This happens a lot to Asian American writers.
Exactly, right?
As some Young Hill can.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when I learned, that about her, and I realized that there is a different gaze when it comes to writers of color, in that we are often seen as merely conduits of an exotic anthropological epicenter. In other words, we are seen as the tour guides rather than the world makers. And I think when that happens, we lose agency and craftsmanship, right? Just tell me how it is over there, and then I'll go on to the next horrific thing, right? So I have...
Tell me what food to order.
Right. And so I realized that I wanted to invite an autobiographical reading, but ultimately refuse it. Again, Moby Dick, people don't realize often, is an autobiographical novel. Herman lived that life. He really did. But he never gets that gaze, right? It's always the great work of an American imagination. And I think I'm not a historian. I'm not a journalist, and I respect those who do. I'm an artist, and I wanted to preserve my agency as a writer of color, first and foremost, and to begin with truth and realize it with the imagination.
Amazing. Would you like to take a few questions from this audience?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. If
Shall
y'all
we?
want to talk, yeah.
Love you.
Love you.
Yes.
I'm still thinking about the helicopter in the reading, and I guess I wanted to hear more about the helicopter. Obviously, as a Vietnamese person, the helicopter is loaded with meaning, right? And the kind of scene that you're painting, it's loaded with meaning. And so I wanted to I have some ideas about it, but I'd like to hear what is happening there in terms of, the war in the U.S. and the war, the war and the U.S.'s war in Vietnam.
It's amazing that a helicopter was coming down over the stores. You asked that question. To repeat the question for those who are watching this on streaming, she asked, what about the helicopter in that scene? I want to know more about the helicopter. It's such a loaded image for Vietnamese Americans. Can you say more about the helicopter?
Yeah, it is. It's a loaded image. It's a haunting image, and it's a haunted image, and it haunts these women. And so, a lot of what we realize with PTSD is it's a time warp. And one of the things that I was interested in writing this book was to recast PTSD not merely as a debilitating illness, which it is, and it can be. And when we think of epigenetic trauma as something that we are victims of, but then what? How do we survive then? How do we survive the aftermath? The war ended in 1975. A lot of this book takes place in the 90s and the early aughts. How do we live afterward when the DNA has literally been changed through violence and trauma? Science has finally caught up with what we've always known in these communities, that it changes us. And I think a lot of times it changes us as a way of protecting us. Epigenetic trauma is also simultaneously epigenetic strength. And one of the strengths that these women realized was the power of the imagination to transform painful realities into a lifeline out. And what Little Dog learns quickly is that he's catching up to their innovation. He doesn't question their reality. If a helicopter is what they need to get the hell out of there, he accepts that it's a helicopter, if only in the mind. And so they speak through the shared, almost cloud of lexicons, which is how it is. So much of what we learn from our parents is embodied. We in proximity and through looking. And Vietnamese particularly, because we don't say I love you. We don't say that to each other. We love through service and action. Right? So when that happens, a child in a Vietnamese household has to pay attention, not only to words, but through the bodies of those around him. And so he's always discovering through their actions, and if their actions have opened up and transformed a rust and tan Toyota into a Huey helicopter, that's what it takes. So I was interested in enacting innovation through the imagination as it happens in a moment of crisis for these women. Other questions? Yes?
I was thinking about Little Dog's relationship to Trevor and the intimate scenes between them. And I was curious as to how you were engaging with masculinity and queerness, and what were the things that were coming up for you throughout that?
Right. Yeah, that's a huge section of the
I'm just going to repeat it for those on the
yeah.
streaming, yeah. Wondering about questions about Little Dog, engaging with masculinity and queerness,
When
and
it came to Trevor.
when it came to Trevor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I've always felt that, masculinity is always seen to me, again, as this monolithic structure that was always there, and the question, the threshold as a queer boy is, do you fit or you don't? And one of the most devastating phrases that I encountered growing up was no homo. No homo is so interesting because it's used as a magic spell, an abracadabra for touch. This very human thing. And so the question that I always had, what has masculinity done to the men in this country when, in order to do this human act, they had to liberate themselves and permission themselves with a magic spell? And thinking on it, I think, well, because masculinity is so young in this country, it's behind. We often think of the West as this innovative place of advancement, but it's behind. It doesn't have the lexicon to hold multiple spirits and genders and souls at once. And I think what I wanted to map out in this book was to see how masculinity, hegemonic masculinity in this country, fails men. That in fact, we can only arrive at toxicity because there was nowhere else to go. The straitjacket of masculinity has destroyed the possibility in boys and men, and it begins with language. Even the way we celebrate boys. You're killing it. Go get him. Right? Break a leg. You went into that game guns blazing. Knock him dead. Right? So what happens when we celebrate men and boys with the lexicon of death? How can we arrive at anywhere but a toxic place? And I think I wanted to show and depict the costs of that for a young boy like Trevor, a young white boy who has his own milieu that orchestrates what he can and can't be, and the cost of how masculinity fails everybody. The hegemonic masculinity in this country fails everyone and harms everyone, especially those who wield it, and even more so for those around it. It's a losing game all around, and it's time for something new. But I wanted to really follow that thread through, that if we're at a place where we have to say no homo to be human, then we've already lost.
I really hate to compare your work to something else because this is just what you read is already so singular in and of itself. But the thing that came to my mind immediately when you were reading the helicopter scene, I thought of Khaled Hosseini's Kite Runner with the scene of them chasing the kites and the rape of Hassan. I just want to know what made you decide to tell that from the women in the scene, from their perspective rather than the innocence of the child, and how that affected the scene overall for you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So, this is going to be a tough one. A rough approximation is thinking about the relationship that this scene has in some ways to Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner, and in particular the scene where the two boys are chasing the kite in the rape of a sun, and then thinking about like what led to the choice to tell the scene so closely through the perspectives of these adult women rather than just the boy.
Right, thank you for that. I think I learned right away when I was experimenting with prose that the I is a very malleable and at times troubling pronoun to move through perspective, in that it's very easy for the I to become a black hole. Everything becomes me, 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 me. And I think it's incredibly tantalizing to write a book and then see it as this uninterrupted monologue. And what happens is you almost turn it into a way to equalize the crimes that you've experienced or endured, because there's no one there to speak against it or to have another perspective. And I knew right away that that was a pitfall, and I didn't want to do that. It was very tempting. Who doesn't want, 200 pages to say and vent and to, I'm a Libra, so, it's all, it was very hard not to justify everything. But I would not be worth my salt as an artist if I didn't took the power of the I, because it's agency. When you write, and I'm paraphrasing Teju Cole here, and he says, to him, memoir nonfiction is fiction. When you start the sentence, you are creating fiction. Even if it's a profile of somebody, how they look, right? If you're looking at a black body, how you describe a black body according to your distance from it, you're creating a fiction, right? There's no such thing as complete nonfiction. And I really felt that. And I thought, the I has to be in service of the world and these characters for it to have dynamic power. So the idea was then, how do I turn the I into a myriad tool rather than a singular one? And so Little Dog is always looking outward, but also corresponding with the world, right? And so it's always kind of like a dialogue that he has. He looks at these women, and then he has these long internal feelings about it. And I think that was important too. And I think that's where, for me personally, this is a very queer book, in that it privileges feeling, which is something so private. For most queer folks, even before or after the closet, feeling is weather. It is everything. We can desire something that we're not supposed to, or something that would harm us, or would deemed taboo. And we can just be sitting there looking at another person that we're not supposed to want. And no one would know that inside us there's a hurricane of feeling. And I think I wanted desire, I wanted feelings to be as palpable and as total as a climate in the book. Maybe 2 more questions. Anyone back here with a question? Yes?
You write music lyrics like she were the songs, because it's so close to the book. I want to see it.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. The question is, do I write music?
Because he feels like this is so close to songs.
Yeah, I'm inspired by music. I listen to a lot of it. Mitski's great. Gus Dapperton's great. But I'm always inspired by music. I was raised on folk songs. I think the human voice is musical to me. And when I read it aloud, it's like another shot at getting it right. And so I do love reading. I think it's the air is like a second page. You get a second chance. The book is a fossil. But when you read it, it's immediate and it's part of the tradition that is so ancient and true to our species. You know, we were poets and we were songwriters, we were art makers and storytellers long before anybody wrote anything down.
Can I have one follow-up on that?
Yes.
Why is it for 500,000 years we didn't need to read it right? We had oral tradition. Where is it gone?
I don't think it's left us. I don't think it's left us. I think there's just more. Books are just more. I don't think the oral tradition has left us. I was nourished by the spoken word community when I came to New York City. When I walked into fancy MFA receptions and I was wearing sweatpants because I couldn't afford anything, and folks, you know, didn't talk to me because I didn't go to Sarah Lawrence or Columbia. It's really happened. And I just thought, oh God, I can't be a writer because I don't got genes. It happens. You have these thoughts. As one does, as an 18-year-old wannabe writer. And I thought, I gotta find a way to sustain myself. And I stumbled into these bars, these open mics. And one of the bars is called Bar 13. And my first night there, it was a slam, and then the featured poet was Yusef Komunyak. And I said, wait a minute, whose life is this? And I think it's all around you. You know, you can do it, you can participate in it. You know, the oral tradition is all around you. It looks different than it was 500,000 years ago, but it's there, and it helped me. It really nourished me because every day I stood behind the microphone as somebody. Maybe nobody knew my name, but I had the air. Everyone, the room was silent. They listened to what I wanted to say. You get your 3 minutes. It's democratic. You get your 3 minutes to make your world, to claim yourself, to add something. And that pressure was so important to me as a writer, because you don't want to waste anybody's time. You had to learn how to get folks to care about your world through language. And in a way, whether you're doing a book or you're writing a song, you're still in that project. How do I get you to care about what I care about through language? That's it. We're writing the same thing. It's all about love and death. But I think in the end, it's how you raise those stakes for a reader. How do you get them to say, yeah, it's love and death, but it's this love and death. And that's how we contribute to this human work. You add your little mosaic, your little piece to the mosaic. Okay. One more question back here. Yes, all the way back there. Say it again. Why was it important for you to make this my first novel? It's important. I don't know if the novel part was important. It was important to turn into a different form, and it was an experiment. I felt that, when I wrote this book of poems, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, my friends and my editors and my peers said, you wrote about American identity as it relates to violence. Now you got to do something else, right? And that's sometimes the mythos that we have in this country, with this capitalistic anxiety to reinvent yourself with the second book, to make a fresh new product, now better tasting. and although I do believe I'm better tasting. Although I do believe that, I also believe that my obsessions were inexhaustible. That 85 pages of poems in paperback could no way answer the question that I had, which is how do I fashion American futurity as it reckons with American violence? That's not answerable in 85 pages of poems. But we're told we gotta do something else, or else it's career suicide or what have you, or you're redundant. You have the same tricks. And so I kind of avoided that question by going into a different form, taking the same questions into a different form. And I told myself, if I'm redundant, if I'm failing discovery, then I'll quit. I'll go back to the poems, and it's fine. So for me, it was always about privileging inexhaustible questions, first and foremost. Because when you do that earnestly, you could take any tool, and that's what it is. Genres are tools. They're vehicles. You can go into any vehicle with the same question, and you can fashion an architecture to live and think by. And I think that's the best thing about a novel, is that it's absolute invention and it's absolute architecture to house a way of thinking. You think through the world, and I think that's what I privileged over plot, was thought, which is, as we know, just as rich, textured, complicated, and contradictory as any thorough and intricate plot line.
Let's send some books.